All right, our lesson today is Chapter 4, Mechanisms of Population Change. We're looking at 4.1 today, which is Adaptation, Variation, and Natural Selection. All right, so here we're just looking at some children on a soccer team, very close in age, but we can see there's lots of differences there, for example, in their heights, their weight, their eye color, their hair color, their ability, skin color would be another one. So evolution, just like the soccer team here, depends on individuals having different characteristics. Individuals with helpful characteristics for their environment will be able to survive better. What else you'll notice is individuals from the same family look similar. Some characteristics can be passed from one generation to the next. Some characteristics are advantageous, some are detrimental, and others have no effect. So in this lesson today, we're looking at differences or variations that exist within species, how they're created, and what processes leads to changes in populations. All right, so what is variation? Variation it's the differences between all living things, right? So if you look at species of, like, for example, humans, we all look different and we all behave differently. So it's all because of variation. Dogs, no two puppies will look and behave exactly the same. So some of these variations may give an organism a survival advantage, some may cause a disadvantage, and some will not make a difference in the organism's survival. So a variation that does give a survival advantage to an individual, that's called an adaptation. And these adaptations allow an individual to survive and reproduce. And then when that organism reproduces, it's going to pass on those adaptations to its offspring, giving them the same survival advantages. And then these adaptations, they will continue to be passed on from parent to offspring over generations, as long as that adaptation gives the organism a survival advantage. If the environment changes, that advantage that was once giving that organism a survival advantage may now give a survival disadvantage to the organism. And we'll look at some examples of this. So then in the new environment, the organism may not survive to pass on its genetic information. So variations, these are occurring during sexual reproduction. So when genetic material from both parents is mixed up, and we saw that also in meiosis, and it can also occur through mutations. All right, let's take a look at some questions. So question 1, sharks have an excellent sense of smell. Is smell an adaptation? Answer is right here. Yes, it is an adaptation because it helps the sharks to survive by being able to find food in the vast ocean. Question 2, give an example of how sexual reproduction leads to variations among individuals in a population. So for example, here is kittens. Kittens with the same parents can have many different looks based on the inherited combinations of genes that occur during sexual reproduction. Question 3, what is the difference between a mutation in a somatic cell as compared to a mutation in a reproductive cell? So recall, somatic cells are the body cells, and then the reproductive cells are the gametes, which are the sperm and the egg. So if there's a mutation in a somatic cell, which is like a body cell, just think of any body cells like skin cells, hair cells, heart cells. Those mutations that are occurring in the body cell, they are not going to be passed on to the next generation. But if a mutation occurs in a reproductive cell, which is the egg or sperm, then it may be passed on to the offspring, so passed on to succeeding generations. Give an example of a mutation that provides a selective advantage. So for example, let's look at this one in houseflies. And we're looking at DDT. So DDT was a heavily used pesticide. So an example of a selective advantage is a mutation in houseflies that makes the insects resistant to the insecticide called DDT. This situation is only advantageous if DDT is being used because the flies with the mutation will have a better chance of survival and reproduction, so survival to the fittest. So in this case, some insects were becoming resistant to DDT. So in this example, if DDT was still being used, the houseflies would then have a survival advantage. Question 5. Give an example of a mutation that provides a selective disadvantage. So let's look at houseflies again. An example of a selective disadvantage can also be the mutation in houseflies that makes them resistant to DDT. This mutation also reduces the growth rate of these flies. So even though they're being resistant to DDT, there is a negative effect as well, which is it reduces the growth rate. If DDT is not present, those flies will be less likely to survive and reproduce because of their smaller size. And again, survival of the fittest. So mutations lead to genetic variations. So selective advantages, let's look at this example of the peppered moth. So the peppered moth has 2 color variations in its population. They're either light or they're dark. So before 1848, the dark variation was very rare, but in the middle of the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution started to change the peppered moth's environment. The soot released from industries started to cover trees, and it darkened the forest environment. After the Industrial Revolution, 90% of the peppered moths were now of the dark color. So what caused this change in color variation? It was because of the change in their environment. The darker colored moths were now able to survive because they could blend in with the darker forest. The darker forest because the soot was covering the bark of the trees. So mutations can provide variation within a population. Mutations are changes in the genetic material or the DNA of an organism, and they are naturally occurring at a steady rate in populations, and it can be increased if mutagens such as UV radiation, chemical compounds are introduced into the environment. So mutations lead to genetic variation. Some mutations will be harmless and will have no effect, but others may create a new variation that provides a selective advantage. And this selective advantage will increase the offspring's chances of survival. If it's a selective disadvantage, it will reduce the offspring's chance of survival. So here we have fruit flies. So parent fruit flies were bombarded with X-rays. The parents then mated with healthy fruit flies, and the offspring had many mutations. The image shows examples of some of the mutations. So we see smaller eyes in this one, no wings here. So the wingless mutation will cause a disadvantage to the fly. The offspring will likely not survive to reproduce. And since the offspring doesn't reproduce, it will not pass on that disadvantageous mutation. So next we get to natural selection. So organisms are best adapted to the environment. Organisms best adapted to that specific environment will survive and pass on their genetic characteristics to the next generation. Those organisms less adapted may not survive or reproduce. So therefore, it's less likely that their traits will be passed on. And in time, characteristics of the population change due to those surviving traits. So Charles Darwin developed this theory of natural selection to explain how populations change or evolve over time. And these are the 5 key mechanisms in natural selection. Number 1, all populations have variations in traits, right? Everyone, all the organisms in a species, they all have variations. They don't all look the same. A selective pressure exists in the environment, such as a predator, extreme weather conditions, limited food resources. If no traits provide benefit over others, there will not be a change in the population. Point 3, not all individuals have the same reproductive advantage. Some individuals are more likely to survive. If they can survive, they'll get to reproduce. They'll find a mate, and it'll be because of particular characteristics, maybe strength or speed or camouflage or resistance to disease. So individuals may have a better chance of attracting a mate due to those particular characteristics. Next, traits are inherited. Traits of the offspring generation are going to be passed down from the parent generation. And then 5, over time, the advantageous trait becomes more common in the population. Lastly here, the desire to mate is strong in all organisms, and it creates a strong selection pressure. So in some cases, the mate's selective pressure is oblivious to other environmental selection pressures. So selecting characteristics based on attracting a mate, that's called sexual selection. All right, so next, we're just going to talk a little bit more about selective pressure. So abiotic and biotic environmental conditions can exert selective pressure on a population by selecting for certain characteristics. These selected characteristics allow the individual to survive and then therefore be able to reproduce and therefore pass on their genetic information. When we're talking about the peppered moth, the soot darkening the forest, that's an example of an abiotic environmental condition, which exerted a selective pressure on the population of peppered moths. So then in the presence of a predator, the soot-darkened forest selected for the dark-colored moths and against the light-colored moths, right? Because the light-colored moths can be easily seen. So therefore, the dark-colored moth population increased, the light-colored moth population decreased. Selective pressure can also be exerted by a biotic component, such as sexual selection. Predators would be another example of a biotic component exerting the selection pressure. Here we're looking at lizards. So there's a lizard right here, and there's one here. So in the photos above, if the environment of each lizard was to change drastically and they were no longer camouflaged, the lizards could be in greater danger than those that can blend in better. So if their environment was to change, they would no longer be able to survive because they can no longer camouflage to their environment. Okay, so natural selection, it's a process that results when the characteristics of a population of organisms change because individuals with certain inherited traits survive specific environmental conditions, and then through reproduction, they pass on their traits to their offspring. For this to occur, there has to be variety and/or diversity within a species. All right, let's take a look at question 1 here. Mutations that give organisms a selective advantage. A, will not allow it to survive. B, are not passed on to their offspring. C, are passed on to their offspring. Or D, do not affect its survival. All right, so mutations that are giving organisms a selective disadvantage will be passed on to their offspring. An adaptation is a trait that helps an organism survive, so it would be C. Number 3, all of the following are examples of adaptations except, so here it would be chickenpox. Camouflage would be an adaptation. Fur that insulates would be an adaptation, and so would night vision. Question 4, which of the following are necessary for natural selection? So like we said, there has to be variation of traits for natural selection to occur. All right, so we looked at so far how do mutations create species variability? Why is sexual reproduction important to the process of evolution? And then it just goes back to that example of soccer. Soccer takes balance, timing, speed, and agility. Some of these characteristics are passed on from one generation to the next, and some aren't. Some people will be good soccer players, some people will get better with practice, and other people will just never be fast enough to keep up with the others. All right, so variations are created by mutations and sexual reproduction. Variations that allow organisms to survive in their environment are called adaptations. These adaptations will then be passed on to the next generation over time. These variations will change characteristics in a population and lead to the evolution of populations. All right, we have a couple videos to watch on natural selection. I'm just going to pause it here.